Welcome back to the podcast. I'm here with Nolan Erck from South of Shasta Consulting, and we're going to be talking about ColdFusion best practices, but more importantly, when best practices are not the best practice. So we'll look at best practices and what they really are, what is technical debt and why you don't want too much of it on your project, picking two of good, cheap, and quick, and how to do that. We'll look at a very naughty tag called CFForm, and when they actually could be cool to use, and when it is okay to change code on your production server. We'll also look at some frameworks that you may not be using, and what to do with error messages and the best practice there. So welcome, Nolan.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, I'm glad to have you back on the show. And Nolan's been very popular. He was speaking at CF Objective. I think you were in 4 sessions or something.
Part of 4 different sessions, yeah.
Yeah, and he's also speaking at NC DevCon, CFCamp, and CF Summit. So we'll talk more about those towards the end of the episode. But first, let's just clarify what exactly is a best practice, because we hear about them all the time, but what exactly is a best practice?
So best practice is a technique or guideline of some kind that has generally been accepted by whatever community you're a part of, in this case ColdFusion or CFML, as that's the, at least currently, most proper, respected way to do whatever the task is you're talking about. And the reason I say most current is sometimes best practices evolve over the course of the evolution of a language or evolution of a technology stack or whatever. So what might be a best practice today may not have been a best practice 5 years ago, and it might not be a best practice 5 years in the future.
So you need to keep up with what they are.
Agreed.
Yeah. And, a lot of companies have like a best practices document that they, share with their team what they think the best thing to do. But it's not like written in stone. You've got to revisit it every now and again.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I found, I was actually discussing this with a few people in the ColdFusion community just a few days ago, is there's also a difference in what best practices are discussed in the real world day job web development versus what your college instructors tell you is a best practice. So if you're learning computer science at school right now, and I had this happen to me personally as well when I was working on my degree, the things that my C++ instructors would say, this is how you build proper C++ apps. I was fortunate that I, at the time, worked at a place with C++ programmers, and I would then take the code samples from my professor to work and show them that and ask questions. And quite often I'd have the day job employees say, that's not how you actually do things in the real world. It's slow, or there's a compiler bug that causes that to not actually work the way your professor thinks it works, or whatever the thing was that we discussed. So sometimes best practices are, it's the current within the space you're in, adopted correct way to do things for the time being.
So what about technical debt? What is that?
So technical debt is kind of related to best practices. And again, the general consensus is the fewer best practices you use, the more likely you are to incur technical debt in your application. And technical debt is basically bad stuff that happens in your app. The example I usually give to my non-technical clients when I'm discussing changes we're going to make to their web app is, well, yes, we can do things, we can fix your bug with this really short-term quick fix. It'll take an hour or two, but there's a lot of technical debt involved in that. Or we can budget a little bit more time and fix it a more proper way. There'll be less technical debt there. And then I follow that up with technical debt works like this. Say I have a great big dam holding back water. The dam springs a leak. Well, the quickest way for me to fix that hole, the hole in the dam, is just plug my finger in the hole. It took very little time, very few resources just to plug the hole, and we're done. And if a second leak springs up, I can do that again and very quickly fix that problem. And that works short term, very quickly to solve a small problem, but eventually I run out of fingers. And if that 11th leak happens, I can no longer solve problems that quick, cheap way. I'm now stuck with a bug in my app or a hole in the dam holding back water that I cannot fix given my current setup. The better practice in that case would be, rather than stick my finger in the hole real quick and plug the leak, let's take the brick out that's damaged, replace it with a better, more structurally sound piece of brick wall and mortar and whatever it takes to hold that section of the wall in place more properly. Yes, it takes a little bit more time and resources up front, but longer term, that's the better way to go, and it makes the whole structure more sound moving forward. And that's usually how I explain technical debt to clients. Is it's sort of like, think of your code and your app as that wall that has sprung a leak. We can fix things quick and dirty now, but you might come back to resent that, in a month or two, or we can spend a little bit more time now fixing it the more proper way with better long-term results.
Well, and the other thing that comes to me is if you've got too many places where you've stuck your finger in a hole and you're holding it there, it kind of reduces the maneuverability you have in the code.
That's another great example. Yeah, exactly. If I have one hand holding back 5 leaks in one section of it, I can only stretch so far to solve other problems in that structure. And yeah, that's a great point as well.
And how this might show up is it might be you have your database, isn't structured too well. Maybe it's not normalized, or it's effectively a flat file.
Yeah, there's all kinds of different ways you can incur technical debt in your application. It could be things like at the database level, like that, not using foreign key constraints to keep your data integrity high, using not properly normalized data. It could be things as simple as the way you name a variable is if you're using perhaps you're using the word date for a variable in your ColdFusion file, and in ColdFusion, maybe it lets you use the word date, but when that code gets translated into something that gets stored in the database, maybe date becomes a reserved word inside your JDBC driver, and then by the time it hits the database, it's causing SQL errors because there's a name collision with the reserved word in the database. And so things like, well, rather than using short, easy to type, potentially reserved words, maybe a better practice might be, why don't you combine a data type prefix on the front of your variable name? Instead of calling it date, if you're referring to the date someone was hired, maybe name it something like DT hired or hired date, or something that takes a little bit more typing but is a more long-term, better way to build things like that. And it could be small things like variable names all the way up to database integrity. It could be practices in place too, not necessarily code you're writing, but things like changing code on the production server. So, this is a really quick fix. I don't need to go to the hassle of logging onto my dev server and making a change and submitting a pull request and testing it on the QA server first. I know what's wrong. I'm just going to FTP onto the production server now and make the change directly. And then, that might be, that might take fewer minutes of time to fix, but now your code on production is out of sync with the code in your source control repository, and it's out of sync with what's on your development environment. So the change you make after that one, you're going to have 10 times more work to do than previously had you just followed the practice of check code into your Git repository and use some sort of modern practice like Jenkins to push that file out to production correctly. You don't have any negative side effects of it.
Right, because down the road, you might forget that you've done that, and then you're maybe building a copy of the production server, and you get to copy that file over. Or another thing is maybe you didn't document how the server is configured, and now you're having problems when you had to rebuild the server.
Exactly, yeah. So sometimes it feels like setting up best practices initially adds a lot of work to a project. And there can be a little bit of time you need to allocate when you start doing these things. If you're starting on a brand new project, or you're on a project that's been around for a few years and nobody's used any good practices, there's no source control, there's no deployment system like Jenkins, there's not a proper dev environment versus a production environment, things like that. Yeah, it can take a little bit of time to set those things up initially. You may need to budget a day or two or something to configure everything and get it all dialed in. But once it's there, everyone on the team moving forward has so much of a better, more efficient workflow that everything just, it's so much better for everyone. I've got a client, we just set Jenkins up on their server. It's kind of a newer client of mine. They had one server, no test environment, no dev environment, just the production server that the previous developer was writing his code on and deploying everything out that way, and that was working. Well, now when they became my client, they were asking us to make bigger changes to the site, integrate different sort of payment systems, doing a little more Facebook integration and some other kind of odds and ends that I just frankly wasn't comfortable just launching onto their production site instantly. I figured, no, let's set up a QA staging server for you first, make sure everything looks good there and is proofed correctly by you guys. You give it your blessing and say, yes, it's ready to go, and then we'll push it live. So the first thing we did was we set them up with version control. So now all of their code is in GitHub. which makes it really easy for my team to split the projects. Nobody's FTPing files back and forth. Nobody's emailing zips of projects back and forth, which is a giant pain in the neck. There are no .old or .mine files in the code. It's all just .cfm and .cfc proper source code. And now we also have Jenkins on their server as well. So when I do fix something on my laptop and I want to push it to their staging server, all I have to do is check the code into the staging branch, and Jenkins takes care of the rest. It sees, oh, Nolan fixed a bug, and he marked it as something they need to proof on the staging server. It automatically copies that code down to the staging server and sends me an email and a Slack notification saying, that's ready to go. Go ahead and tell the client they can start proofing it. They give it their blessing. And then when I'm ready to push that change up to the production server, I do the exact same thing. I take that change that was already written and just mark it as, okay, put this in the master branch now. GitHub pushes it up to the server. Jenkins sees that new change. It copies it down to the production server for me, and I get an email saying it's ready to go and it's on the server. And none of us have to touch the servers. We don't have to log on and FTP things back and forth. We don't have to log on and run any sort of scripts to copy old files over or anything of that sort. It's all completely automated. It's repeatable. Takes very little human interaction. It just makes everything overall better when you use good, sturdy best practices like that to work on projects.
Great. So we talked about, before we got on the episode, about good, cheap, and quick, pick two. Tell us a bit about that.
That, I don't know where that phrase initially came from, but I've heard it used in software development conversations for a long time now. The idea is you can build something any two of those ways that you want, but you'll never get the third, no matter how hard you try, out of your application. I can build something cheap and good and cheap, but I won't get it. It won't be quick. I can build something good and quick, but it won't be cheap. Whatever the third thing is that you're trying to get around, you'll never, or whatever way it is you're trying to get all three of those, you'll never actually get all three of those when you're building an application. There's just not a way to do that. If I had developers that work really, really fast and they're very, very good at what they do, well, I'm paying for those resources. There's not a person in the world anywhere that is an amazing developer and writes things just lickety-split super fast and only charges $10 an hour. That just doesn't happen. If you want very, very good resources, you have to pay for them. You're either paying in time or in the number of people you have or the quality of people. There's some sort of a trade-off in whatever it is you're trying to do.
Well, you might be paying in technical debt.
Exactly, yeah. That's the other thing. You might be paying in human dollars for buying the time of different smart people to work on your app, or you might be buying it in terms of technical debt. Yeah, that's another example that I've heard used about technical debt a lot too, is it's sort of like taking a loan out at a bank. If I need money right now to start my business, well, a quick way to do that is get a loan from the bank. That's quick, but it's not necessarily cheap, is it? They're going to charge me interest on that loan, and eventually that loan has to be paid back with all of that extra interest on top of it, making it a bigger, more involved project than it was initially. And technical debt is kind of the same way. Yes, I can do a real quick fix on your app and take out a loan against the code right now to solve these problems, but eventually that loan with the interest gets paid back. And that's the technical debt we have to deal with.
And if you get too much technical debt, the code can totally collapse. So.
It can, yeah. There are times I've seen applications that were just not managed well by anyone with proper architecture vision about things. And there's just so much legacy code in the app that you can hit a critical mass point where clients will call up with what should be a seemingly easy request to change in the code. And yeah, the more technical debt there is, the more likely, and this has happened, sometimes I have to call the client back and say, you know what, that should be an hour worth of work. But because of problems X, Y, and Z that your previous team never addressed, it's now going to take me 3 days to undo all of that stuff and do it properly in a way that won't open up a bunch of security holes or break 10 other things or whatever. So yeah, it very much is a balancing act you have to be mindful of when you're building software.
So let's have a talk about some of these different things that are regarded as best practices but aren't always best practices. And the first one is a tag that people generally avoid like the plague, which is CFForm.
Right, CFForm.
So why is that a best practice to not use CFForm, and then why did you choose to use it on a particular project?
So CFForm and all of the related what they call ColdFusion UI tags. So CF Select, CF Grid, CF Input, all of those kind of tags in that family of features in ColdFusion. They're all kind of considered a bad idea for the same reason. That reason being those tags, they generate UI code when you use them. So if I use the CFForm and CF Select tags, what those tags actually do is they render out HTML and JavaScript to the client side as part of their the result of using those tags. Lots of other tags we have in apps generate HTML output. I've written a bunch of custom tags myself that do that. That in itself is not a problem. Here's the problem with that. The JavaScript libraries used by those CFForm tags internally are not things you can update manually. So like I believe they use ext.js as one of the built-in JavaScript libraries in the ColdFusion UI tags. Let's say the ext.js library comes out with a new version of it. Version 7 is out of that library, or that library completely gets deprecated and the people in charge of it say, you know what, never mind, stop using that. We're not supporting it anymore. If you find security holes in that code or bugs, we're not going to fix them, just stop. There's no way to drill into the ColdFusion engine and easily remove those files and update them with a new version of whatever that JavaScript library is. So by using the built-in ColdFusion UI tags, you're locking yourself into what is pretty quickly dated JavaScript libraries in your app. And JavaScript moves so quickly these days, you want to be able to get in there and swap out whatever JavaScript libraries you're using and put in the new ones with the better bug fixes with the newer features pretty quickly. And there's just no way to do that with the ColdFusion UI tags that are baked in there. And plus the quality of the output from those tags just isn't that great, to be perfectly honest. I love ColdFusion. I think the product itself is really good. They tried to make those tags be sort of a one-stop shop solution for lots of different use cases. And that's really, really hard to do. And these tags kind of fell short of being able to do that. So a lot of people find that when they start to use those tags, they work okay for small to medium-sized web pages. And when you get beyond that and need a little bit more fancy or complicated functionality, those tags fall short really quickly. And then people that have used those tags all over their app, they're kind of locked into using those tags. So in addition to using these bad UI tags, they're now having to stack a bunch of HTML and CSS hacks on top of it to get the output that they want in their app. And it's kind of a bad way to go about doing it. The better practice these days is don't use those tags. Just write plain HTML5 tags and you can use JavaScript libraries. There's nothing terribly wrong with using jQuery or jQuery UI or whatever the thing is you're using to make your output look how you want it to look. The idea is just don't use the baked-in libraries that come with ColdFusion. Import your own. Just go out to jQuery.com or whatever the library is you want, download the files yourself, and then just add the script tags to your site header or site footer to incorporate those libraries. Import those libraries yourself. And that way, when a bug fix comes out, you can add that bug fix easily to your app without being locked into anything from the ColdFusion engine.
Well, that all makes good sense, but you found a project where it did make sense to use CFForm.
I did, yeah. So historically, the best thing about ColdFusion when it first came out for a long time was it's super easy to start using ColdFusion. You don't have to actually be a senior advanced web developer to start writing CFML pages. And that's been one of the big selling points for a long, long time with that app. So as part of my consulting business, I teach classes on how to build different sorts of web and mobile projects. I'll teach 3-day boot camps on building Android apps or writing database queries, whatever the thing is. And I got booked to teach I think it was a 3 or 4 day class on ColdFusion. So I showed up and there were three gentlemen in the class. They said, okay, here's the situation. None of us are developers. Okay, that's fine. You don't really need to be hardcore developers. They go, no. I'm in marketing. That's a database server maintainer guy. And the third guy over there has a little bit of a marketing background too. They all work for the same company. There was a horrible restructuring at their office recently, and a lot of the IT guys lost their jobs. So for some reason, the powers that be pointed at these 3 guys who were not technical and said, you 3 are now in charge of running the company intranet. Go figure out how to learn ColdFusion. Your jobs depend on it. So they showed up at my class and said, help, we need to figure this out. So we spent about a day trying to do kind of basic programming concepts. Here's a variable, here's an if statement, here's a for loop. Little bits of it made some sense, but I could tell by just how they were reacting in the class that the light bulbs weren't actually clicking on for these people. They were kind of watching what I was doing and saying, okay, I guess that, yeah, if I make a variable called X and I stick 12 in that, and then I do CF output X, okay, it's going to show 12 on the screen. But they were having a really hard time grasping, how do I write a bunch of code and use this in the application at work? And how do we connect all these things together so that I have a job tomorrow? So we talked about what their intranet did. And it turned out their intranet, it was all older ColdFusion stuff, very much tag-based CFML, most of which was just list pages of outputs from a database table, and then a detail page. When you click on a link in that, it shows you the detailed record of that. I think 2 of the 3 gentlemen had used Dreamweaver a little bit before to edit basic HTML pages. So they were kind of familiar with Dreamweaver. And I thought, okay, well, Dreamweaver has ColdFusion support baked into it. Let's turn on the ColdFusion support. And now, instead of writing code, you're literally just dragging and dropping things from the right-hand column into the pages on your website in Dreamweaver, and you can edit things in little display panels in Dreamweaver rather than purely writing code. Yes, it's writing code behind the scenes, but they were much more comfortable in a visual layout environment like that. So I thought, okay, well, we can do that. The downside to doing that, though, is all of the ColdFusion stuff that's baked into Dreamweaver is those CF tags, CFForm, CFSelect, input, those sorts, CFTable. Those sorts of things are what you drag and drop in the Dreamweaver panel to build ColdFusion pages inside Dreamweaver. So I went, all right, well, let's see if this makes any more sense. Turn on Dreamweaver, and then you can just click on things and say, okay, here's where you put your database query. They had a database guy that can write queries, so that part was easy enough to do. And you can click in here and see, okay, look, all your columns show up in this little panel. Just drag and drop the things you want onto the panel and hit save or render or whatever the button said at the time. And that seemed to make a little bit more sense and got them further along the path. So rather than, grinding away for 3 or 4 days, trying to teach 3 very non-technical people how to become technical, which was proving to not be a great use of anyone's time, we went with, all right, here's Dreamweaver. Everyone have a copy of Dreamweaver? It's $200. Just grab this from, fill out a real quick expense report at your office, put this on your 3 computers, here's how you do this. And then showed them, like, look, you can drag and drop a query, you can add a link to your detail page, just kind of do this for all the pages in your intranet, and you should be all set. So yes, I told 3 or 4 people, use CFForm, use CFSelect, build your apps that way, because that was the right solution for their predicament. It was that, or it was send them all back to work the next day having no idea what to do with a mountain of homework. And they didn't need a lot of homework. They needed to make sure they knew how to build these list and detail pages on the company intranet and tell the boss, yes, we can do this for you. So yeah, cool. I told them, go use. I didn't even tell them these are a bad idea. I just said, here's, click this little thing, click this CF select and click this CF table, and that's how you get the results you want. Oh, okay. And they were off to the races.
So let's go to another best practice and why you broke it, which the best practice would be don't edit the code on the production server directly. Right.
So yeah, we mentioned earlier when we talked about the client that didn't have source control or Jenkins or anything installed. Yeah, it's a horrible idea to edit code on your production server. I would never recommend even fixing a typo that way. I would always push, even if you're adding a comma to a sentence, I would push that through version control for the proper practices, just to make sure everything stays in sync. I had a client I worked for a couple of years ago, kind of a smaller outfit, about 5 people at the company. And my main point of contact was the VP of, I think, marketing, basically. He knew a little bit about HTML. He was decent with his HTML. He knew what he knew, and he knew not to go any further than that. So he could make a new paragraph of content on the page. He knew how to create a link, make certain words bold and italic and that sort of thing. And he was good at doing that bit of work. He did not want to spend the time setting up a dev environment on his laptop. He didn't want to waste time with a staging QA server. He wanted to find a typo on the website or find a place where he needed to add a new paragraph of text and be able to change it. So he would. And he was at least good about, he understood his code has to be in sync with my code. So he would make changes and then email me and say, I changed these 3 files, please update your environment to match. And after a while we would do that, and we kind of went back and forth over, well, I should be making all of the changes. He's like, no, I'm going to keep making changes. Don't slow me down. You're already working on writing ColdFusion code on the back end. I'm going to keep doing this thing here. And I explained to him, like, we don't want to get out of sync. We've already accidentally overridden your code once or twice. Let's prevent that. And he's like, I'm the VP of the company. I don't have time to do this dev staging Jenkins continuous integration stuff. It's my laptop. I have Dreamweaver installed and an FTP client. I know how to use it. Nolan, find a way to let me be productive doing what I'm doing and solve that problem. So I thought, okay, he's not going to follow the typical practices of a developer. He's going to make a change on his code, FTP it up to production, and be done. And that's all he's going to ever do. So I kicked around a few ideas, talked to him a little bit more, and we did agree that I asked him one day, I said, well, when you're done making your changes, will you at least click a link that I send you to let me know you're done making changes? And he said, yes, I'll click a link when I'm done making changes so that if that sends you a notification of some sort, you can do that. I said, great. So I just made a URL on the website for a CFM file. And you can do this with any language. It's not ColdFusion specific. We installed Git on his production server. And what happens is whenever he clicked that I'm done making changes link, that link would do a git commit on the production server of any code he changed. It would make a new branch or just do a commit or something where it would mark all the changes he did and stick them into the GitHub repo for me. Then it would email me and say, he made changes to these files. Make sure you grab the latest things down. So he wasn't using Git as far as he was concerned. And he didn't have to change his workflow other than clicking this link once a week or so whenever he made changes. But all the code got into Git and got marked in source control properly. And we were able to keep everything in sync and keep it all safe. My biggest worry was he would change something, maybe accidentally delete a line of ColdFusion code, not realize he'd done that, and then blame me. And he would call my phone and say, and he had done similar things a couple of times before, kind of just innocently, not trying to be a jerk client or anything. He just, little bits of code had changed. He didn't realize they'd changed. He said, Nolan, what did you break? Well, if I'm making some of the changes in source control and he's not following source control practices, I don't have a good neutral third-party report to reference saying, no, actually, you're the one who changed that line of code. It wasn't me or my team. But by getting him to use this save my changes link that I gave him, his workflow stayed basically the same, but everything got marked into source control. Even though he was breaking a best practice by changing code on production, technically, yeah, it was still unmarked code that was not in GitHub for the few minutes it took him to open that link and click it, but it was still a heck of a lot better than just letting him blindly change things on the FTP server on production through FTP and then emailing me whenever he was, updating files. So he, to this day, I think he still clicks that link whenever he's done making changes, and it automatically adds things to GitHub for him and checks it into the repo.
Cool.
But it's working.
All right.
Not a great practice, but
it was the right thing for him.
Yeah, it was the right thing for him. I wouldn't recommend it for the whole world, though.
No. So let's talk about frameworks. So what's the best practice on frameworks? Should people be using them or?
Yeah, so just for clarity, we're talking about MVC frameworks because there are dependency injection frameworks and other things out there. But overall, yeah, if anyone's building anything bigger than a glorified brochure website, like if you have a website for a hair salon, you probably don't need much more than a page showing the hours you're open, maybe a page with a few photos showing different hairstyles you do, and a page with prices or names of the staff. Something that small, you probably don't need a framework to handle that. Anything kind of medium-sized and up, you need some sort of MVC framework to manage the application. And I pretty much always just, by de facto, anytime I'm building a website, I grab either Framework 1 or ColdBox and use that as I don't even think about it anymore. I just start with one of the frameworks based on what I'm doing, who the client is, what kind of features I might need, and go from there and build my apps. And one of my early clients had a very large website that you could argue could be done with an MVC framework. We weren't building anything that couldn't be done that way. The problem we ran into more so was the team itself and the knowledge base of everyone that needed to be productive on the team. It was myself as the project lead and the CTO of the company who was designing the software. He knew all of the business rules. This was an app for the semiconductor industry. So we were building software for companies that make and sell microchips. And the CTO knew all of the business rules of how that needed to work. He was designing the data model of what the database should look like and how the business rules for required fields and that sort of thing should function. But he's not a web developer. His background was Fortran and assembly language on pretty old processors. nothing I can really use in a web development world, but he needed to be productive and be able to describe the business rules on a page-by-page basis. I don't know how much you or the listeners of the podcast know about building microchips, but it's not like ordering t-shirts. You don't just say, oh, I want 400 large blue. There are thousands of parameters that go into ordering and designing a microchip. So he needed to be very productive very regularly so he could go in and change the requirements of these fields are required, except if A and B and C are true, then D is not required, or whatever the things are he was describing. I also had 2 junior developers working with me, one of which knew some ColdFusion. She had passed the ColdFusion certification test before. The other one was a guy who knew some PHP and was trying to figure out ColdFusion to help me out. And that was the team that we just had available at the time due to circumstances. So I needed all these people with different backgrounds to be very productive very quickly. We had several demos with clients at conferences and trade shows that had already been booked. So we needed to make sure, all right, how do we get code working quickly to at least show off the greatest number of features in the app? None of the clients that are going to see this demo are going to look at the source code. None of them are going to be able to tell if we used ColdBox or not, let alone be able to judge the type of technology we're using under the hood. They just wanted to see the business rules in place and see, yep, that's the tool we need to use to make microchips. This is great. Let us buy one. So I have a PHP guy, a junior ColdFusion person, a Fortran-based CTO, and myself. How do I make them all productive very quickly? Well, it turned out everyone either knew or could understand XML very, very fast. XML made a lot of sense, so we just sort of wrote our own domain XML-based language. Rather than spending a lot of time teaching people the ins and outs of database queries and CF this and CF that and this tag or that tag, we just started describing the different pages in the app, of which there were a lot, using this XML dialect instead. Okay, here's how we need to reference this layer in the microchip. Just use a layer tag, and then you put these things on there, and that will mark these parts of the layer as required. When you need to reference this part of the geometry in the microchip, just use the geometry tag and do it this way, and that will describe the next piece of the app. And then underneath the hood, I just had a ColdFusion engine that I was more responsible for that could look at that XML and then turn it into usable, required fields. When things get stuck in the database, I can note which things are required, which ones aren't. I can enforce business rules that way. So my options were use this sort of XML-based thing that everyone kind of understood quickly and was able to be productive with, or spend a lot of time teaching 3 very different people, MVC and object-oriented programming, which I recommend doing. Those are the best practices in not just ColdFusion land, but most modern web development. The reality is we went with a lot of these decisions because of the constraints from the conferences and trade shows that had already been booked. We had deadlines that had to get hit. There were great big trade shows where huge companies were going to be watching this product, and I wasn't going to be in the room, nor was it right for me to explain, well, we're trying to teach our junior developer what an object is right now, and as soon as he learns that, then we'll be able to build this for you. I just had to say, nope, here's tags, here's these XML things I wrote, put those into your files, it'll generate the right output, and go from there. So in that case, yeah, we skipped Model Glue, we skipped ColdBox, we skipped Framework 1. We looked at a couple of different MVC frameworks early on, and my gut just told me, this isn't going to save us any time right now. It's going to make things a little bit more slow for everyone involved in this project. I'm just going to skip it and go with a custom solution instead. So we did. Cool.
So let's talk about error handling and the best practice for dealing with errors, which I'm going to guess is logging. Why you wouldn't necessarily do that.
Yeah, so a lot of people recommend if your app throws errors, use the CF log tag or some sort of logging mechanism to log all of those errors into a log file or a database or something to that effect, so that you can have an IT person look at that log and look at the reporting based off of it later and tell what types of errors are happening and how frequently they're happening in your application. Separate from that, it is very easy to set up code in ColdFusion and other languages too, so that anytime your app throws an error, it sends you an email instead. Here's a copy of the error that I received. Here's a copy of all the form variables and URL variables that were in play at that time. Maybe a copy of the user's session scope, whatever other odds and ends you have available, can do that. And that technically works, but if your application throws 200 errors a day, you get 200 emails you have to deal with. And they can all look very, very similar. If it was not 200 different people, if it was one person just clicking the same button over and over again, you might have 50 emails from the same frustrated user. There are no metrics when you just get emails dumped to you that way, so it's hard to tell, is this 50 different errors from 50 different users, or is it one person that just got frustrated and kept clicking the button over and over again, and that sort of thing. So yeah, a lot of people frown on shooting emails to your IT staff or to anyone when your app throws an error. They say, no, put it in a log, use a tool like BugLog HQ to track all those errors and monitor them and just go from there. And normally I recommend that too. That is the better way to go for most situations. I had a client that had a legacy ColdFusion application. The previous developers were no longer around. They asked me to come in and sort of babysit the application and see what I could figure out about it. And the office where this particular client is all very, very nice people, none of which are technical. They wanted to know what their server was doing though. So I could have spent the time installing BugLog HQ and setting up metrics and using fairly technical terms to explain to them things like, oh, well, this problem happens because your form post variable, buffer is not big enough. This problem happens because the SQL hit a JDBC error and blah, 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 blah. Stuff none of them care about. But that particular office, they do so much work by email. The culture there is they email everything. They don't use Slack. They don't use text message. They just shoot emails back and forth to their staff all day long. That's how they like to work. If they see 4 messages come in from the VP, they know he's excited about something and doing a lot of work on a particular topic. If they see multiple emails come in from an account manager that's working on event XYZ, they know that something's happening with that event. And that's how they like to work. So I proposed to them, okay, well, how about anytime your site throws an error, I'll have it shoot you an email with all the details in it. You probably won't be able to understand the details, that's fine. But you'll be able to at least tell by the volume of emails you get, is the site working properly today or did something happen? No emails means it's fine. And if you get 50 emails, give me a call and I'll see what I can step in and take care of. And they love that idea. Yeah, let's do that. And nobody on the team has been, they haven't added any technical people to their office. There's no one there that understands those emails now more today than they did when I first set this up for them a while ago. But they like that ability to just tell, oh, the site seems to be behaving today. We saw 2 emails come through for errors and nothing else happened. And then they can tell when something is going wrong because they'll see the flood of messages come in on their server. And for that particular client, they liked that visibility. Just the sheer fact that they got an email, whether they understood the technical pieces of it or not, that was enough transparency to them where they can tell what the server is or isn't doing. They can tell when we push a change up to the server, did it work well? They got no emails. Did something bad happen from that change? Oh, they got a whole bunch of error message emails that day. They can tell, they get that kind of visual indicator to them that works well for keeping track of how their applications are behaving. So
Cool.
for clients like that, I still suggest this to clients every once in a while. When I get a client that has kind of a similar mindset, they do a lot of stuff over email, they love their iPhone, they always looking at messages, not super technical. It's probably not worth my time to try to explain to them how IIS does routing in and out of the ColdFusion engine, or how form variables are processed, or whatever the thing is they're discussing. But I'll sometimes tell them, how about this? If your site throws an error, I'll have it shoot you an email. And if you get a lot of emails with a lot of errors, something's going wrong, give me a call. Okay, yeah, that sounds great. So not the recommended practice, not something that a lot of the speakers at conferences like to promote, I don't think. But for the occasional client, it seems to be the solution that they enjoy the best. Enjoy is probably not the best word, but you know what I mean. It
Works for them.
It seems to work for them.
So what about when the problem isn't code and you're the developer and you're kind of stuck in the middle of other folks?
Yeah, that kind of thing happens sometimes too. You do have cases where the technical debt isn't really lines of code that are bad. The technical debt is more of a process issue. Things like, maybe I've had this happen before, I've seen it happen. People in the network operations team or the IT team, maybe they're rightfully so very paranoid about people trying to break into the website and cause problems. That in itself is not a bad thing. What I ran into though was one IT department that said, we are not allowing any URLs in our application nor any form variables in our application to include the word alter, A-L-T-E-R, because that could be somebody trying to alter something in the database. You need to go through all of the code, everything in the app and change anywhere where it says alter, A-L-T-E-R, to be A-L-T-R, so we can tell the difference in a hack attempt versus you're doing whatever legit thing you're doing in the database where you need to use the word alter. Now, first of all, it's a terrible waste of everyone's time and resources and money. Second, that's at best a very outdated mindset about how you build and secure web applications. And third, what do you do if somebody's trying to sign up for an account in your app and his name happens to be Walter, W-A-L-T-E-R? That guy's now going to get an error just typing in his first name. That should never happen in an application, regardless of what kind of security you're trying to implement. The problem there isn't code. It's nothing in the database. The problem there is education. The people in charge of that server are just out of date or just not properly communicating what they're trying to do with the rest of the team. So what we recommend in those kind of cases is find somebody else that is a high stakeholder in that project. In my case, I had a lot of success with the vice president of marketing. The marketing team tends to care a great deal about what the website looks like and how users interact with it successfully. They don't care as much about how many lines of code it took to write it. They don't care whether you're using ColdFusion or Fortran or whatever else. They just want the website to look and behave the way they expect it to by the deadline. So in those cases, I had a lot of success. I would just contact the VP of marketing and say, here's the situation, here's the problem, here's what the network operations team is recommending we do, and here are the problems I see with that happening. And as soon as I turn it into things that the marketing team cares about, like your users will have a lesser experience if their name happens to be Walter. They will not be able to sign up for accounts. They will not be able to click on links that generate revenue for the company. As soon as I start using marketing terms and concerns like that, they're very quick to get on board with solving the problem a different way. And they'll back me up on talking to the network operations team and saying, yeah, we can't do this ALTR versus alter thing. That's just not going to happen. Find another way to solve the problem. And the reality is that should never be a thing anyway. In the case of ColdFusion, just use CF query param, and that will solve the bulk of your SQL injection concerns about that sort of thing. So there are quick ways to do that that the NetOps team just didn't happen to be versed in at the time. Yeah, sometimes the problem isn't code. Sometimes it's you need to educate other developers or other people just involved in the project, technical or otherwise, and go from there.
Great. Well, these have been great best practices, and to realize they're not set in stone. Sometimes you need to do things differently.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's shift gears a bit now, and a question I've been asking a lot of people on the show is why you're proud to use ColdFusion.
I'm proud to use ColdFusion. First, I'm a consultant for a living. I've been doing this for about 10 years. I've made all of my money in that time, not to sound arrogant, but I've made all of my money by having a good reputation for what I do. I don't advertise on Craigslist and things like that. People like the job I do and they pass my name on to someone else, and I get more projects that way. So often clients will call me and they'll say, here's the problem we're trying to solve, whether it's the app we want to build, the website we want to build, whatever the thing is. What do you recommend as the best solution for that problem? So I try to look at everything objectively and say, okay, what truly is the best technology stack to use for this problem? And 9 times out of 10, it's just ColdFusion every time. I'm quicker with it. You get more done per line of code out of the box. Yes, you can do a lot of the similar tasks with .NET and PHP and whatever else, but you often have to buy add-on packs of some sort to get those to work, or you're writing more code. You're importing more third-party libraries, things like that to get the same kind of results I get for just a fresh install of ColdFusion. So I get more done with it straight out of the box. It makes my life easier. It makes the projects go more quickly. A lot of that integration from different third-party libraries has already been done and QA'd by Adobe. I have fewer headaches to worry about when building larger scale apps. It just works, and I really like that about it.
Cool. So sometimes people have said that ColdFusion is dying, but what would it take to make ColdFusion more alive this year?
I think my personal take on it is, yes, the number of people using ColdFusion is getting a little bit smaller, but I think it's I think we're now seeing sort of 2 camps of people in ColdFusion. There's the very advanced kind of modern web development camp, people like the Orta Solutions team that are doing a lot of really great modern innovative stuff with ColdFusion, and that team is going really strong. We're also seeing a lot of people on the other end of the spectrum who are what I'll call the legacy ColdFusion developers, people who learned how to use ColdFusion in maybe 2000 or 2001. They learned how to use the CF include tag and maybe custom tags, and then they kind of stopped learning at that point. They're not doing object-oriented development. They're not following best practices. They're not using MVC frameworks. Those two camps seem to still be kind of steadily maintaining or maybe growing a bit. It's that middle group that learned more than just the 5-tag CF include stuff, but not enough to truly be the really forward-thinking, object-oriented modern web development group. And that middle group, that's been kind of going down, I think. This is just my opinion. I think that group's been getting smaller in the last few years. Those are the folks that are moving on to other technology. Those are the people that have been the most vocal about ColdFusion is dead, and so now they're jumping ship and using Ruby or Python or whatever the thing is that interested them the most. I think the thing that's going to help keep ColdFusion alive the most is that forward-thinking group, people like the Ortis team and the Blue River team with Mira CMS, the Framework One guys, all of those guys that are doing the forward-thinking work that's building modern tooling for ColdFusion. We need more of that, and we need people that are in sort of those camps to help with educating the people on the other side. So you get there's a lot of web development still being done in ColdFusion where they're just using the old technology, CF include and custom tags, and not a whole heck of a lot else, either because they're scared to learn the new things, they think it's going to be overly complicated, maybe they think it's too many files or too much code, it doesn't actually solve the problem they solve. Maybe they're just not aware of it either. There are a lot of people that just, for whatever reason, are not able to budget time and money to go to conferences and to learn what the current trends are. And I think we need to bridge that gap more and fix that problem. Let's take the people that are still writing code as if it's 2001, whether intentionally or otherwise, and help them fix that problem. It's like, you know what, it's actually not that hard to go from your CF include stuff that you're comfortable with into a small MVC framework like Framework One. And then if Framework One doesn't solve every problem that you have, well, it's pretty easy to add on things like TestBox or DI1 or Wirebox or whatever afterward when you get to the point where that would help solve a problem for you. On that note, I actually, shameless side plug, I give a presentation sometimes at conferences called MVC with and without a framework that is exactly for that people in that predicament, people that are still writing CF include based code. They don't really quite know how Framework One or ColdBox works, and they need to kind of be inched along those steps to gradually get up to, okay, MVC isn't quite so scary. I can actually do that. It's not as weird as I thought it was. So if people want to check out my website, they can download the slide deck and code samples from that talk and hopefully learn a few things about how to improve their skill set there. But yeah, I think it comes down to a lot of training and helping to educate the community.
Cool. Well, we'll put links to those in the show notes for this episode. And I also think one of the ways, if people can't afford to go to conferences, listen to some podcast episodes or read some blog articles,
Yeah, absolutely. The podcasts are great. There's the CFML Slack channel. If people want to hang out in Slack and chat about ColdFusion, they can do that. I blog myself when I can. There are still several people that blog about ColdFusion. Ben Nadell, of course, has his blog up still, and Ray Camden, I believe, has all of his ColdFusion content still online. There are a few people floating around out there that blog things. The Mira guys, I don't know if it's getmira.com or if it's blueriver.com, but one of their websites has a blog on it now too, where they're posting about at least different things you can do with Mira CMS, and that's of course all ColdFusion based as well.
So you're going to be speaking at a bunch of conferences, Nolan. You're going to be at NC DevCon, CFCamp, and CF Summit. So tell us what you're looking forward to at these different conferences.
Let's see. They're all really good conferences for different reasons. NC DevCon, I really think that's an underrated conference. NC DevCon is, first of all, it's a weekend, so nobody has to take a lot of time off work to actually go to the conference. I know that's a big pain point for a lot of people. They say, oh, well, my boss won't pay for vacation time for that, so if I go, I have to use 3 or 4 days of PTO to attend a conference. I was going to save that PTO for the family vacation next year or whatever. NC DevCon is Saturday and Sunday, so there's no time off work. Tickets are really cheap for that too. Don't totally quote me on this, but they're around the $200, maybe $250 range for the whole weekend. You get 3, 4, maybe 5 tracks worth of content. There's ColdFusion stuff, JavaScript, modern tooling and security and all kinds of things. And it's a weekend in North Carolina. So the weather's usually really good. Everyone's friendly there. it's a really great great setup. People that run that conference do a great job of organizing everything at NC DEF CON. I recommend that to everyone I know that has even a remote chance of going. I live in California. It's about a 5 or 6 hour flight for me to get to NC DEF CON, and I still go every year. Worst case scenario, I have to leave work a couple hours early on a Friday, maybe cut out at noon, fly out there, go to the conference all day Saturday, all day Sunday. I can take a Sunday night flight back and be in California by 11 or midnight Sunday night, so I'm ready to go for work the next day. There's really minimal pieces of life you have to alter to get to NC DEF CON. I love that conference. ColdFusion Summit, it's in Las Vegas, so for very opposite reasons, it's a lot of fun to go to CF Summit. There's tons of things to do in Vegas.
Yeah, I talked with Alicia from Adobe about CF Summit a few weeks back, and it's just incredible what you can do in Las Vegas.
Yeah, there's
also there's going to be hundreds of ColdFusion developers there, so
that's true. That one, NC DEF CON is great. It's about 5 different tracks, and there's a decent amount of ColdFusion content there, but it is by no means an exclusively ColdFusion centric conference. There's JavaScript and other mobile and stuff going on there that's related to ColdFusion, but not specifically Adobe CF. The ColdFusion Summit is 2 or 3 days of nothing but Adobe CF content. It's new features in 2016, stuff coming up in 2018, how to secure your ColdFusion applications, how to do different current techniques in ColdFusion, like use MVC libraries or ORM libraries, or how to do this, that, and the other thing with ColdBox or Wirebox or Framework One stuff, and different object-oriented patterns that are useful in ColdFusion. They have sessions usually on how to use the new API manager that comes with ColdFusion. It's all very, very much focused on that technology stack, that community, and it's really large too. There are several hundred people that go to the ColdFusion Summit in Vegas every year. So if you go to conferences and it seems like maybe the head count is lower than you're expecting, so if you're like, oh, this isn't really a great conference, there are not as many people here that do what I do as I was expecting. Maybe you go to NC DEF CON and you happen to be hanging out with or near a bunch of JavaScript developers, so you don't feel like you can relate to them if all you spend your time doing is ColdFusion. Go to the ColdFusion Summit in Vegas, and you'll be around people that do basically nothing but ColdFusion all the time. There's a way more CFML-centric presence at that conference.
Also, if you want to talk to, the Adobe staff who create ColdFusion.
Yeah, that's true too. They're all at that conference.
Right. So great place to buttonhole them about some feature you wish was done better or existed.
Absolutely. They're pretty receptive to that kind of feedback too. Though, at least I've never had an Adobe CF team member sort of scoff at me when I want to approach them and ask a question about, hey, why did you do it this way? Or can I get a feature request in for the next version of ColdFusion to fix this bug or to do this thing? They're always very receptive to those suggestions. Whether they have the ability or resources to implement all of them is an entirely different story. But Alicia and Rakshith and all of those people are very, very open to talking to everyone in the community and learning more about how they like to use ColdFusion in their projects.
And then the third conference you mentioned is CFCamp, which is in Munich, Germany.
It is, yes. I'll be in Munich, Germany again in mid-October for a few days to attend that conference. I've been to CFCamp, I think I've been 3 times now. This will be my 4th year. And NC DEF CON has been at the same campus every year that they've done it. ColdFusion Summit has always been in Vegas, so it's kind of the same environment. They've moved hotels a few times, but it's basically the same kind of setup every year for the summit. CFCamp, the first 2 years that they did it, so this conference has been around for about 5 years now, I think. The first 2 years, it was also in Munich, Germany, but in a little bit more of kind of a suburb off to the side of Munich, Germany. Not a whole lot going on around there. And 2 years ago, they moved it to the actual Munich airport. For those that don't know, the Munich airport has this great big shopping mall business center out 10 feet out the front door. So you land off the airplane, get your bags, walk out the front door, you cross a big open plaza, and there's 3 or 4 great big towers there with restaurants and various grocery stores and restaurants and all kinds of different things going on there. And in one of those towers is the CFCamp conference. They rent out 3 or 4 different rooms for the different tracks. They have the expo vendor booth area, just like you'd expect at any other conference. And they have all the food right there as well. Food at CFCamp is probably the best of any conference I've ever been to. They have this really great spread of restaurant chef quality fish and potatoes and meat and vegetables, and just it puts the typical conference food stereotype out of being even a possibility of something you'd get there. So I really like the way they take care of everyone there. It's a great environment, and again, it's a very, very ColdFusion centric user base that attends that conference. It's not exclusively ColdFusion. I would say the CF Summit conference is almost pure ColdFusion content, and NC DevCon has one or two very, very strong ColdFusion tracks, and the other tracks lean a little bit more toward mobile development and JavaScript and tooling, some other things. And I put CFCamp kind of right between the two. So if you do mostly ColdFusion stuff, but you do also have to touch Java once in a while, you do also want to know what Docker is about and some other modern web development stuff, maybe you play with Java or Kotlin or things like that, CFCamp is kind of right in the middle there for that community. And again, the ticket prices are pretty reasonable for that one. It's a 2-day conference. They often have a pre-conference day that is something one of the sponsors is taking care of. I believe one of their sponsors is usually the Preside CMS folks who are based in Europe. They'll do a 1-day kind of show and tell of the different things they're working on and tack that on to the conference as well. So you can go for 2 days or 3 days there. Yeah, I really like it. I speak literally 5 words of German. I can say please and thank you and I'm sorry and order coffee, and that's about all I can do. And I've been fine every year I've gone to Germany and hung out at the conference with everyone. They're all really nice. The people in charge are ColdFusion developers themselves.
A lot of Germans can speak English anyway.
Yeah, I've never had a problem doing what I need to do to survive while I'm in Germany for a week. I can get get food and get directions to where I need to go, find the bus I need to take to get to whatever. The public transportation system there is amazingly involved too. So you can get anywhere you need to get and never set foot in a car.
Great.
3 times. I've never rented a car once. Just between buses and trains and taxis, like you're fine.
Well, it sounds like you've got an exciting rest of the year, Nolan.
That's the idea.
Yeah. So I appreciate you coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure talking to you, Michael.